I'm here today in Strasbourg, in France, or rather I'm next to Strasbourg. I'm here at Park France, which is one of the largest military collections, or museums I should say, in France, and I wanted to show you a couple of very interesting exhibits today. So why don't we go inside and take a look. This roughed up piece of metal here is actually the French B1 bis heavy tank. Like in any French tank, speed wasn't one of the main criteria while developing this tank, so you end up with a big box of metal moving at a leisurely pace, allowing you to really take in the scenery around you while being shot at from all sides. The B1 bis is actually an improvement to the previous B1 French heavy tank. It received fancy 60mm front armor, it had the funny 47mm in the turret and this very funky 75mm gun up at the front. It received a better 300 horsepower engine and it was fitted with a very fancy transmission that makes you feel like you're riding in a luxury vehicle. This development started in 1935 and France was very happy with the test results, making a lot of orders in 1936 for the B1 bis. The B1 bis saw extensive use all around World War II, not only in the French army but also in the German and in the Italian army as captured vehicles. Did you know that the B1 bis actually had an ARL-44 radio telegraphy set, meaning it could only communicate in Morse code? It's like having a really fancy phone at that time but with really bad reception. Like you can make calls, but good luck actually getting through to anyone. Now, the B1 bis actually was very fearsome and was feared by a lot of German tankers, but as the years came, stronger and stronger guns got developed and the B1 bis eventually was obsolete. This particular B1 tank was knocked out somewhere during the war and was then a war memorial and display near some fort near Lille in France. Then it got purchased by the owner of Park here for his collection and it had the vehicle number 40. Even though it was badly damaged, it was still bought and now there are plans to actually restore it. This B1 is part of one of 11 remaining B1s around the world, with 3 of them being here in Alsace. The one B1 bis right here that you can see and 2 B1s in the restoration process here at Park. Just a quick fun fact about the B1. Did you know that during the development of the Stridswagen 103 by Sven Berge, the fixed 75mm gun at the B1 inspired him to actually have a fixed gun on his particular tank, meaning that the legacy of the B1 tank still lives on today. I don't know if you can tell, but that piece of scrap metal is actually an ARL-44 tank destroyer, or rather it was one. Well, the ARL-44, it was all made just to boost the French army's pride back then. I mean, do you really need speed and agility if you can just move at a leisurely pace, carrying about nothing and a weight of 20 MBTs at the same time? Let's not forget about the very impressive 90mm gun that is about as accurate as a toddler with a water gun. I mean, with those tracks it looks like an upgunned version of the B1, or rather a parody of it, and it really didn't do that much. It's more of a joke than it's of a tank. But let's explore a bit about the history about this piece of metal. Development of this beast started in occupied France, where they wanted to build something for the future to oppose the Germans if they eventually get liberated. Which in 1944, when Paris was liberated, actually happened. They had their plans for this 30-ton future main battle tank with 75mm gun to really show the Allies that they are a valid part of the Allied forces. Eventually enough, they made the first prototype, the ACL-1. It had the 75mm gun and had a lot of armor at the front, which was quite impressive at that time because it was a heavy tank, right, at the end of the war. But other than that, the turret and the sides were paper thin, rendering it completely useless. But that didn't stop them from trying again. The French engineers decided, okay, let's make the gun bigger because a bigger gun makes everything better, right? So they boasted this 90mm gun inside of the turret, but the turret was too small. So what did they do? Exactly, they took parts of the scuttled battleship Dunkirk and welded together a turret to hold this thing, this absolute long baguette, or whatever that is. So after that, they had their plans, but eventually it was useless because even after showing it off at the victory parade at Champs-Élysées, the M47 Patton from America showed up, ironically enough with a 90mm gun as well, rendering this thing completely useless. So after they've been scrapped and, well, sold all over the place to shooting ranges, 5 of them could luckily enough, been recovered. One of them is in Saumur in France at Musée de Blind. Two of them are here next to Strasbourg. The other ones are God knows where. But the ARL-44 was rather an experience for the French tank designers rather than an actual success. But you'd think they learned from their mistakes, but the French engineers just did the same mistake, even worse later on with the AMX-50, which was even heavier and even more unsuccessful. Which is quite sad, because this thing, it looks cool, right? But it's absolutely useless. They were even so proud of that development that they replaced their captured Panther tanks after the war with the ARL-44 to really, you know, boost the French pride at that time. Because, well, okay, given the circumstances, it was a very sad time. But, well, the ARL-44, nothing much more to say other than this is an absolute joke of a vehicle. And, well, I'm pretty happy to see one of the 5 last remaining tanks in the entire world. After the next one. Tracked mines. When I say tracked mine, you usually think about the Goliath, but not this. This thing right here is the so-called Springer, the lesser-known brother of the Goliath tracked mine. This thing has an explosion load of 300 kilograms. Just a quick comparison, the Goliath had 60 kilograms of explosives. This thing has a whopping 240 more kilograms of explosives than the Goliath. It was also manufactured by NSU Werke and shares many different things with the Goliath, like the undercarriage, the tracks, the engine, and a lot of other different aspects. However, it saw very low production from 1944 up to 1945, with only 50 versions being made and only 2 survivors up until this day. One here in Strasbourg in France and the other one in the Bovington Tank Museum. Unlike the Goliath, the Springer has been operated by a soldier who was sitting over there, and he had to drive the Springer up to the target area, and then he had to leave it and then control it with the radio equipment. The Springers were operated by so-called radio-controlled armored companies, consisting of 3 Sturmgeschütz, and each Sturmgeschütz then operated 1 or 3 Springers.
If you thought the Springer was small and useless, wait until you see this.
This little gremlin right here is called the M22 Locust. Well, tanks usually belong on the ground, but this one, it's special. This tank is air transportable. That's why the British called it Locust, to really strike fear into the heart of the enemies. But how exactly did the Americans end up with this go-kart looking type of tank? Well, how did this project come to life? In May of 1941 there was this task for an air transportable vehicle. The contract has been given to GMC, Christie and Marmon Harrington. Those of you that know, Marmon Harrington got the project. Eventually they called the project the so-called T9. But the tank in the beginning was way too heavy, so they tried countless of times, and after a lot of failed attempts, they finally developed the M22. It was so light it could fit into a plane. Well, the plane chosen for this task was actually the C-54 Skymaster. The M22 saw action around World War II in many different theaters, but some of them were sent actually here in France into Alsace for the US division that was stationed here, but actually never saw service with France. Well, there's not a lot to say about the M22, I just really wanted to include this little goblin of a tank in this video. On to the next one. The M10 Wolverine. The M10 was an attempt to fit an M7 gun onto a Sherman, which kind of worked. It received its iconic pentacular shape of the turret with a counterweight at the end, making it look like something straight off a comic book. Now, this was an open-top design which allowed for better communications with accompanying infantry. This was very effective. On the other hand, it was very susceptible to artillery shells and incoming planes. The M10 had an increased upper front plate angle, so shells will ricochet more likely when hit because it was rather weak at that time. But the M10 could pierce up to 100 millimeters of armor at a range of 900 meters. But with the arrival of Jagdpanthers and Jagdtigers on the battlefield, the M10 became, well, obsolete. This particular M10 Wolverine tank destroyer is called Souffleur 2 and helped during the reduction of the pocket of Rianne around 1945. It survived the war and took part in the victory parade on Champs-Élysées. In 2007 it was exhibited somewhere near France, then was bought off there and got restored to beautiful condition, and it's now in running order.
Before we continue, I'd like to mention that I made another video about an M10 that stands next to the Maginot Line. Should be somewhere in the corner right now. Also, I want to quickly appreciate the love put into the museum. There's a lot of things to interact with, and they made a whole German dock filled with water to display their rare German Schnellboot.
Ah yes, the ISU-152. The pride and joy of Soviet tank destroyers, where the main answer to any question was just blowing everything up with a large cannon. Well, the I in the name of the IS-152 actually indicates that it's been made on an IS tank chassis. As you might know, in the IS tank series you had the IS-2. The IS-2 had a cannon of 122mm. But that wasn't enough for the Soviets, so they just took the chassis and slapped a massive 152mm gun on it, and then it worked. But that's Soviet engineering for you, right? If no work, you make gun bigger. These artillery pieces were actually made to replace Soviet-towed guns, but due to the lack of space inside, they actually had to be transported by rail to the front lines where they were fighting. Ironically, the IS-152s were one of the first Soviet tank destroyers, or tanks in general, to reach Berlin and then to, well, destroy German fortified positions. It was operated by 5 people, and even though it looks pretty big, as I mentioned earlier, it has no space inside at all. Although it has a lot of armor in the front, making it a perfect tank killer. It was so effective, in fact, that it's been used in many different countries after the war, long after. Actually, the IS-152s are still in service with some armies around the world today. This Polish IS-152 was part of the 13th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment and took part in the Victory Parade in Warsaw in 1945. But after the collapse of the USSR, many Soviet technologies and tanks have been sold all around the world, and this one ended up in the Imperial War Museum in Duxford in England. But then in 1996, a private collector has bought it and, well, decided to sell it here to MM Park in France in Strasbourg.
Before we get to the final tank, I just quickly wanted to show off what other things you can find here at the museum. Okay, here we go.
An M5 Stuart, an M24 Chaffee, an M8 Greyhound, a Willys Jeep, an M4A2 Sherman, an M26 Pershing, and an M18, an LVT-4, a Hetzer, a whole German Schnellboot, a T-26, a T-34, and an SU-100. A very big collection of guns. A Churchill, a Daimler armored car, a Comet.
And that's just a fraction of what they have. Anyways, here's the last tank.
The Italian tank meme still lives up to this day. Or rather, when it was developed. This is the Autoblinda 41, or the AB-41. And the Italian engineers just couldn't suppress the urge to design Mario Kart-looking vehicles, so they resulted in this. In roughly 1939, there was this requirement to have a fast-moving armored car so they can use it in their new colonies in North Africa. But after that, well, they designed this newly made thing on the market, and it had 2 8mm machine guns in the turret and 1 at the back. That new vehicle was called the AB-40 because it had only the 8mm machine guns, but it had dual control so it can drive forward and backward, which was very efficient and kind of new at that time. But then the Italian tank engineers wanted something new, so they developed the AB-41 at roughly 1940, around that time. So what did they do? They took the turret of the light tank L640 or the L640 and fitted it on the AB-40 chassis, making it an AB-41. It was highly effective, and they were built pretty much all of the time, and they saw extensive use in the North Africa campaign and somewhere in Italy as well, but eventually the armor wasn't enough to stop Allied forces.